Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Tom Beeks. I'm a trainer here at the Bell Foundation, and we're going to be talking today about setting up a new EAL department in an international school. So, I guess this is probably quite a sort of niche target audience for a lot of people because many schools will already have EAL departments, but I do know that it's increasingly something that we do get questions about. And it can be that schools are suddenly facing a change in demographics, or schools are um, starting up from scratch. You know, they're opening a new school, and yeah, this is something that many EAL staff have experienced. I think this sort of having to start from a blank slate. So we're going to explore that today. And I'd just like to welcome everyone who's attending live. Please use the chat to ask any questions that you have. If I can, I will try and address those during the presentation or at the end. And feel free also to share your own experiences or ideas as well, because of course I'll be talking about some ideas, but there is no sort of single way to approach something as complicated as setting up a new EAL department. So if you have anything to add, please do. Okay, and this is what we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to kind of go in chronological order in terms of the processes and the types of activities you want to be doing if you're starting an EAL department. So we'll begin with thinking about information gathering. We'll move towards setting targets and planning. We'll talk about establishing policies and procedures. And then we'll think about how you might embed and develop that provision on a more sort of medium or long-term basis as well. Okay. So, one of the first challenges I had when doing this webinar was that it's really hard to illustrate in an interesting way what good quality educational administration looks like. So I went through our image library and I found this beautiful picture of Cymorthyn Slate Quarry in Wales. And it represents the terrifying or tantalizing blank slate that you might be faced with when setting up an EAL department from scratch. So with a blank slate, we'll need to start with some form of initial information gathering or review or EAL audit to tell us about what is currently happening. And here are a number of things I thought would be useful to include in that, if that's what you're doing. So first of all, we need to start with understanding the context. And if you're new to the school, then that might involve understanding both the local kind of school context and the national context within which the school is situated. You may also want to think about the linguistic profile of your school. So that's basically what languages are spoken in the school, but also what are the socio-linguistic and socio-cultural factors to consider as well. For example, what status do local languages used have? How are they viewed by families, students, and staff? What is the role of English in the local context, in the community? If you're in a context like I don't know, say Singapore, where there's English is a kind of lingua franca in the community, versus a context where perhaps English isn't really spoken at all, except within the confines of the international school. These are all going to change perhaps how you approach organizing provision and talking about EAL provision. The other thing to understand, I think, is the attitudes and expectations towards education that are held by, in particular, families and parents, I think, but also the teaching staff within your school as well. So what types of teaching are familiar and expected in your context? And how much variation and diversity of that is there within your school. So, it might be that there are quite shared expectations. It might be that they're very different if you've got a very diverse cohort of learners and teachers. And understanding, what those expectations are, again, is really important. Um, it's also going to be important to learn about any national laws or regulations that apply to the teaching of languages. So, for example, some countries will have a mandatory stipulation that the national language or the national curriculum must make up a set percentage of a child's education or things like that. So again, these are particularly obviously relevant if you're new to the country and the context, and it may require a little bit of research on your part. Um, the other thing I think it's really important to get a grip on early on is to understand your school's mission statement, and in particular, what does it say that is offering its students, and how well does this align with what is actually happening at the school, and in particular with regard to your multilingual students. So you can also look at the existing policies and what they have to say about EAL and multilingualism. And often what they don't say is more telling in these cases as well. And that's going to help you understand where there might be gaps in understanding or provision that need filling as well. And I think a useful thing to do is conduct a bit of a policy audit. So it's really looking at your school's communications. I use the word policy, but it really refers to all the school's documentation and communication around multilingualism. So it might include things like what they say on their website or publicity, what they're promising parents and learners, for example. You might want to check existing EAL or language policies to see what they say. And if those don't exist, then you might want to have a look more broadly. So things like teaching and learning policies can often have information as well. And, it's important to look for considerations for multilingual classrooms. Are they thinking about it through a multilingual lens? You may even want to have a look at SEND policies or information, partly to see if they're multilingual. There is provision for our plurilingual learners who may also have SEND, but also in some cases, schools will fit their EAL information within an SEND umbrella. That's increasingly changing, and it's from a Bell Foundation's point of view, I would strongly advocate that EAL is not an SEND, therefore shouldn't be really involved in explicitly in SEND policies. But you may see that there is some overlap depending on your school and how they've approached things in the past. The third thing that I think is really important to understand when we're just sort of gathering that information at the beginning, and it's also possibly the trickiest one to understand, and that's the attitudes towards and the confidence that exists within the school towards supporting EAL learners. And also, it's about learning the strengths and skills that already exist within your school as well. And I think that's especially important to do for staff, but we can also think about students and families as well. So, there are some very obvious possible strategies we can look for to do that. The staff questionnaire would be a simple one to do because it can be done online and doesn't necessarily have to require a lot of resources. And within that questionnaire, I think it might be useful to ask staff about their confidence in supporting EAL learners. Now, bear in mind that their own confidence doesn't necessarily correlate with good practice. So that will need to be triangulated. We'll talk about, but measuring their confidence is useful. Asking them about what challenges they face in regard to supporting multilingual pupils, what kinds of support they would like as well from an EAL team. And I think this can actually reveal a lot about attitudes and understanding of what effective support is and needs to be as well. So it can actually give you a lot of extra information. And the other thing that's really useful is to ask about what additional languages are spoken by staff. It's something that sometimes we forget to do, but especially if you have a very diverse cohort of staff, you'd often get some really surprising answers, and it's quite useful if you're in a linguistically diverse school to know which staff speak which languages, because obviously that can help you with communication with new families or students who may speak languages that aren't widely known within the school. Um, to triangulate the information we get from questionnaires, things like observations or learning walks or drop-ins, whatever your school calls them, they're going to be a really important source of information to understand what's happening, what techniques and strategies are staff already using, what is not happening, and this is going to help you identify both strengths and good practices, as well as identify where there might be gaps and where there might be more training or support needed. And this links straight to the next point, which is also, it's really useful to identify your allies and your critical friends. So your allies are likely to be existing staff who have either lots of expertise in supporting EAL learners, or maybe they lack expertise, but they're just keen to be involved. They want to learn and improve and help support those learners. So they're they're the kind of people that can are really happy to try out new initiatives and experiment. Find out who those people are, and then you can often use them to help begin the process of introducing new ideas. Alternatively, you may also have the critical friends who might be the more cynical staff that you have in the staff room. The kind of person that rolls their eyes at any new initiative or suggestion. But actually, these people can be quite useful because they can give us they're really good at coming up with barriers and problems, which can be quite helpful in understanding where teachers might find the barriers and the problems to changes that you want to initiate. Like, I think it can be quite useful to have these people, and actually, they're not used to being asked for their thoughts and their input. Often these kind of staff, so it can be a good way of bringing them on board and making them feel involved, and also making sure that you can tailor any future communications with those teachers or any trainings or things like that in the future to fit with their expectations and their understandings. And also, last but not least, it will be useful to get a sense of the student and parent voice around multilingual provision in your school. So, students can be surveyed in their home language, perhaps, if you want to get a more nuanced message about how they're feeling, especially if you've got a bilingual school and you're able to translate, something easily into another language and get a lot of information. Or you may have a student council or something like that you can talk to directly to understand what students' needs and feelings are. And similarly with parents, it's important to understand things like why they want their child to learn English, and how important that is in comparison to learning curricular topics, for example. And there can be a lot of variation in this. And again, that could be done informally, more formally via parent meetings, parent groups, questionnaires, and so on, according to your context. So I appreciate a lot of this is quite abstract, so I thought I'd try and make this a bit more concrete by applying it to a case study. So I want to introduce you to clueless Kevin. Okay, bless him. He's been working at an international school in Austria for a couple of years as a primary teacher, and he's also an EAL specialist, and he's the only EAL specialist in the school. But the school's had a recent change in student demographics, and there's more and more learners entering the school who need significant English language support. So one spring morning, the school principal summons Kevin into their office and informs him that the school is setting up a new EAL department and that Kevin has kindly volunteered to become the new EAL coordinator. I'm semi-joking with this example and being a little bit flippant, but I have heard of examples of these kind of things happening in schools. Hope it's never happened to you, but these are the things that can happen to people. So anyway, luckily for Kevin, he's told he'll be given a very small budget, but they're also going to be recruiting two new specialist EAL teachers for the start of the next academic year. And Kevin's also been given a reduced teaching timetable for the rest of the term in order to do some work to set up the department. So, where does Kevin start? And well, if we think about the things we just talked about, Kevin's already pretty familiar with the school. He is from the uh, local community. He's an Austrian teacher, so he's pretty familiar with the culture and he understands the school. But he does recognize he's a bit hazy on the policies. So he does some exploration there. He digs around, digs out the teaching and learning and inclusion policies. There is no languages policy at the school at the moment, but he notices that EAL policy is a sort of couple of paragraphs that's tagged on to the end of the teaching and learning document. Um, in order to build his understanding of what might be needed across the school, he has a chat with the heads of each section. So he talks to the early years, the head of early years, head of primary and secondary, particularly focusing on the secondary and early years, which are the areas of the school he isn't as familiar with. And he asks them what the specific challenges they each have, and he also asks them about things like data collection and what information they have to gather and share. And he also requests if he can go in and observe some lessons. So he does some observations. So he picks lessons where he knows there are learners, EAL learners with support needs, and he goes along and he watches what happens and he makes notes and he tries to get a better understanding of what's going on. So that's how Kevin's approaching this. Now, let's move along to the next step, which is sort of the planning stage, I guess, or the setting of targets. And again, I dug around in our image library and we've moved from our blank slate quarry to this beautiful deep dark forest. And the forest represents the importance of being able to find a path and choose a direction to go in when you're faced with kind of endless choices, right? There's no one obvious way you can go. And I think that's often what it feels like when you're just starting to set up a new department or a new strand of provision, because really everything needs to be addressed. So how do you prioritize? And well, there's no real right answer in terms of what is the right thing to prioritize. It's going to vary by context. Okay, so there's not really too much to be said. But it might involve things like embedding a clear EAL assessment process, ensuring effective in-class support, or adapting your curriculum for EAL withdrawal so that it aligns with the mainstream curriculum, and it isn't just a kind of EFL package that doesn't speak at all to what the students are actually learning in the classroom. And I think a good way of always approaching this is to think about, well, what are the challenges or barriers in my way? And then you can start considering what the available solutions might be to overcome those. And of course, with some barriers, especially when they're like financial, for example, or to do with the structure of the school, they're not necessarily things that can be changed. So it's thinking about, well, if I can't change it, how can I at least mitigate it? Or how can I, what are the things that can be done? And all I would say is, if you're a sort of middle leader or an EAL coordinator or an EAL teacher, school leaders are obviously a lot more receptive to propose changes if you come to them with solutions to accompany challenges that you're facing. And so once you've had a chance to think about those, and hopefully you've had a chance to talk to somebody else around about them as well. That can lead then to the creation of an EAL action plan or an EAL development document, or however your school might want to label something like that. And again, you can structure that however you like, and in a way that's logical to you, or using whatever pro formas your school might use. But a possible framework might look something like this, where you have a table and you could have questions like what needs to be improved or changed, who needs to lead on this, and also who else needs to be involved, the resources are needed. These could be financial, but it also thinking about things like materials or teachers' time, staff time, and when does this need to be done by? And again, I think the more granular you can be in these kind of plans, the more realistic you can be in terms of your deadlines. And I, encourage you not to just say, oh, the end of the year or the end of the term for everything, because um, chances are, in my experience at least, you never get as much done as you think. And you might want to include as well other considerations. Um, so what this looks like then, I'll give you, let's go back to Kevin. And so he's creating his action plan. And one of his priorities he notices is there's not really any consistent in-class support for the Band A and B learners. That's the learners that are with lower English proficiency, especially at secondary level, he's noticed. So this is something that he thinks, well, this really needs to be addressed. They're secondary learners, they're going to be having exams in a few years. That's really a kind of high priority to make sure those learners are getting good quality in-class support, along with any withdrawal support they get as well. So he breaks this down and he thinks, well, one thing we need to do is timetable that support. So, with the EAL team, so that we can make sure they're in the right place at the right time. And the other thing we can do is to train the teaching assistants that are in the classes as well, so that they're more comfortable with the strategies needed to support our EAL learners. Who's involved? Well, he goes to the head of secondary, because that's the person who's going to have to liaise with in terms of timetabling and also in terms of getting time for the TAs for training and things like that. Although Kevin's going to be the person responsible for delivering the training and actually preparing the EAL timetable ultimately. In terms of resources, he'll need access to schemes of work for secondary teachers, so that he can see, which subjects areas and which topics might be specifically linguistically demanding, and where those learners might really need that in-class support. He's also requesting some tablets for the EAL teachers that will be joining the team, so that they can, while they're doing their in-class support, they'll have access to that as a tool. And he'll need time with the teaching assistants, some CPD time for training as well. So they agree that the training can take place in August, during kind of the induction, the start of year CPD phase. And he wants the in-class support by the end of September, once they've had a chance to assess and actually identify which learners need that support. In terms of considerations, well, timetabling is probably the main one here, to ensure that the EAL classes don't clash with other things that will be important for the learners. And that also means considering, well, what lessons can the learners miss? And again, I don't know if there's a right answer to that question, but I know schools take different approaches. Some schools will make sure that the learners miss, I guess, lessons that aren't part of the core curriculum. So often that might be things like music or even modern foreign languages. Whereas some other EAL coordinators would argue that that's actually potentially less useful, because classes like languages and music are things that EAL learners can actually thrive in, because they don't necessarily require a lot of linguistic proficiency. And then it's taking them out of the really linguistically demanding subjects. So it might be things like history or English literature, where it's more appropriate. And again, there's no real right answer, I think, to that. It will depend on the context of your school and the situation that you're in. So yeah, there's a question there, but which lessons would you suggest? Yeah, I mean, personally, I would err on the side of, it's about, there's no point forcing learners to sit in a core subject, if you like, if they're not learning anything. So it's probably about understanding which lessons they're able to learn in and which lessons they're struggling to learn in, and having some way of measuring that, and making that, and to allowing that to inform your decisions, I think. And again, that may vary from individual to individual. It's unlikely to be a blanket thing, and it does make it a little bit tricky. Okay, so how are we doing? So we've gathered some information, we've identified some targets and where we want to go and priorities. So I think the next set of tasks, and I guess this is probably the meatiest part of the process, is establishing those processes, policies, and procedures that are underpinned by clear guiding principles and ideas, which we obviously include in our policies. So this time I've chosen a picture of some lovely earthy soil because it represents the work we need to do, before we get the fruits, if you like. So just as we need to, do the hard work of digging and preparing the soil before we grow our beautiful vegetable patch or garden, likewise, we need to do the hard work of creating these carefully considered procedures and policies that underpin everything that we're going to do as an EAL department. And they've identified 6 broad areas that you might want to include, and we'll go through each one in a little bit more detail in a moment. But those 6 areas are policy, assessment, recruitment, induction and onboarding, parent information, and administration, or as I like to tend to think of it personally, the boring bits. And I think it's really important to say before we go into details that you don't have to have all these things in place before the department is set up or before any support happens, because these things take time, and they're also informed by what happens and the learnings you have as you go through the process of supporting your learners. So these aren't expected to necessarily be there all fully formed on day one, but these are things that you're working towards creating and building. So let's start with the language policy, because this sort of underpins everything else. So I think obviously the starting point is you either need to create or more likely update. In my experience, most international schools these days will have something like a languages policy. It might be labeled as an EAL policy, or something similar. So I'm not going to go into lots of detail about that now in this webinar, because we did an entire webinar on that last year. So you're welcome to go over to our YouTube channel and have a look at that. And we also did a blog about it as well. I'll share the links for that in the email that we send out after this webinar. But you should be able to find it on our website or YouTube channel as well. The thing to say about updating a policy is that there may be some things that you can't update yet or you can't write about yet, because things like assessment procedures take time to get embedded, and you might not have your all your procedures in place yet. In which case I think it's then appropriate to focus on your vision and the sort of set of principles for the kind of support you want to provide in your school, and use that to set expectations around the type of teaching and learning strategies you want teachers to use, for example, and try and keep it as short and as succinct as possible. I think a lot of the detail around processes and pedagogies and so on probably belong more naturally in handbooks or guidance documents for specific teams or groups of staff rather than policy documents. So try and keep it at that sort of sweet spot of not too much detail, but also with enough specificity to give you a strong underpinning of what you want to do, and what expectations you have for the staff and learners in the school. And you might want to also review and contribute to other policy documents with an EAL or multilingualism lens as well. So again, obvious places to look might be things like admissions policies, teaching and learning policies. And by doing that, you're making sure the needs of plurilingual learners get heard, and you're making your presence felt in the school, and you're advocating for multilingualism. And the last point is that a policy is pointless if it's not a living document that's known and referred to and updated. So you need to consider how you're going to communicate it. And I think it's useful to think of a policy as an expression of school identity. So you know, you may not need to communicate it always by just asking people to read it. There may be other ways you can do that. But remember that an EAL policy or a languages policy isn't just for EAL or language teachers. Okay, it needs to be pitched to everyone in the school, and having a core set of principles can play a really useful role here. So you may be aware that the Bell Foundation have a set of 5 guiding principles. I'm just going to see if I can share that with you in the chat box. If anyone's interested, we've got like nice little posters that you can download, if, just as an example of what principles for multilingualism might look like. And yeah, so consider who you can communicate the key messages in that document with, and how you're going to do that. Maybe that could be a slot during staff induction or a CPD day. And it's also really important to share those messages with parents and students as well. And again, doesn't just mean emailing them a link to the policy, but it means thinking about how you might communicate key messages in ways that are accessible and meaningful to families and to students as well. So things like, translated newsletters for parents. I've seen schools work with students to create a student-oriented version of the policy, where the students themselves kind of work together and create their own sort of mini, like student charter to set expectations and agree how to behave and how to work in a multilingual environment in a way that's respectful and it builds everyone up. Okay, there's our policy, so I've got to click through that. Okay, so there's our policy. The other really, I think, meaty part of department is assessment, of course. And I guess the main thing that you need to do is choose some kind of EAL assessment framework to work with. Now, obviously, here at the Bell Foundation, I'm going to suggest you could use our framework. It is free, so that's one great thing going for it. But it's also, it's evidence informed. It's been created by professionals, so we do know it's based on research rather than just sticking a finger in the air and intuition. But of course, it doesn't work for everyone necessarily, and that's absolutely fine. But the most important thing is to have something that allows you to effectively track the progress of your learners and to set learning targets. And think about your context. So with the Bell Foundation, it's aligned with the UK or the national curriculum in England, although I think it's broad enough to be useful in any particular context. There are also frameworks like the WIDA framework, which comes from the United States. So again, it's going to align perhaps better with schools if you're following US or standard aligned curricula. And many schools will use the CAFR framework as well to assess language proficiency. That's the Council of Europe framework, and they use that quite successfully. The only thing I would point out is that the CAFR is measuring general English proficiency. It's not measuring EAL proficiency, which is the ability of a student to operate within the curriculum in a school environment. So I do think if you're using CAFR tools, you probably want to supplement it with some other data to make sure you're capturing what students can actually do in the classroom. And lastly, there are also lots of paid online assessment packages that schools can buy now. And, I can't recommend any of them just because I don't know enough about them. But I know that schools who can afford them often find them very useful. So if you're lucky enough to be able to have access to something like that, then it could be a tool used too. So here are some other things to consider then when we're talking about assessment. And there's 4 areas I think we can look at: initial assessment, formative assessment, summative assessment, and the sharing of assessment data. So in terms of initial assessment, then you'll want to have some kind of initial test or diagnostic test for when children enter the school. This, in my experience, well, first of all, the first thing to say, there's no one perfect test that's in EAL test that's out there that exists to my knowledge. So what you tend to see is a triangulation of different testing materials, a triangulation of English language teaching materials, general ability test scores like the CAT4, self-made tests, online platforms, and so on. I think the other thing, regardless of whatever you're using, you need to create guidance for staff to do the testing, especially for things like speaking tests, having some kind of rubric and a standardized set of questions or topics to go through, especially if the people doing those testing are not EAL specialists themselves. And it's going to be really helpful as well to have a kind of learner profile template where information on your EAL learners is kept and updated, and that can be shared and reviewed by relevant staff. Excuse me while I have a sip of water. Okay, moving on to formative assessment. So as we move through the term and the school year, then this is where our EAL assessment framework will come in. That's usually the main sort of method for tracking progress. But some kind of tracking tool may be useful as well. Often there is a tracking tool that you can download for free that comes with the Bell Foundation framework. But I think most schools tend to find the need to adapt and create their own systems to work with how they track data and use information. So I guess my main recommendation here is find the person in your school who's like the spreadsheet expert, make friends with them, buy them a coffee or a box of chocolates, because that's often the person you want to go to for help if you need to create some kind of fancy spreadsheet that has all the information you want so you can track progress. And as with the initial assessments, you're also going to need to create training materials or information for staff induction or staff training so that staff know about the assessment systems you're using and how they fit into it. Some schools require, their classroom teachers to do EAL assessment. Some schools, it's part of the role of the EAL specialist. So it would, again, depend on your school. And then we also need ways of tracking, I guess, the data and the progress. And schools are often a big fans of, schools, are fans of testing so that they can have data. And in terms of EAL, the key thing I think with summative assessment is to have clear benchmarks, especially if you've got some kind of intensive EAL withdrawal program, so that there's clarity about what level the learner needs to be at, or what are the features and characteristics that need to be in place for that learner to graduate from that program into mainstream lessons on a full-time basis. It doesn't have to be as concrete as a particular grade or score. I think a lot of schools use a more holistic approach very successfully, where there's, it's a combination of scores, but also learner profile, teacher discussions, and so on as well. You'll need to set up some kind of reporting template, especially for parents in particular, but also you may want to have one for internal use too. And again, guidance on how to complete the report for teachers, and for parents, guidance on what to expect in terms of reporting and progress updates as well, which we'll talk about later. And the last aspect is data sharing. And, this is going to look different in every school, but it's important to make sure that there is a system in place for sharing grades, progress, things like projected achievement with relevant staff and leadership. And again, the exact expectations might vary from school to school. Okay. So let's think about recruitment. Find this nice stock picture of a lady searching for a job, like we all do, standing up in a bare room with our laptops. And as a EAL coordinator or somebody involved in EAL provision in your school, you might be involved in recruitment. So that if you are, then that will mean preparing things like job descriptions or job specifications, lists of relevant qualifications and experiences desired. And even if you're not directly involved in recruitment, this can be an area where you might want to try and get involved and signpost with schools what types of qualification and experience are useful in an EAL role, because they might be different to the typical teacher profile that they're used to recruiting for other roles. In particular, I'm thinking of things like English language teaching qualifications often can be more relevant or more desirable than, say, qualified teacher status in this respect. Although, of course, they may also require QTS to work in the school, which is fine. But making recruiters aware that qualifications like the Cambridge CELTA and Delta can indicate that there's at least some familiarity, especially Delta, which is a diploma level qualification, and you know is a sort of a master's level qualification. There's also an opportunity here, I think, to advocate for equitable recruitment in terms of multilingualism as well. So this is where ensuring your school isn't using terms like native speaker in job descriptions as a shorthand for other qualities that actually have no relation to first language. So, you know, when they say native speaker, usually what they mean is they're looking for a particular proficiency of English or academic English language proficiency. They're looking for a particular set of cultural knowledge or a particular style of teaching. Okay. And you know, they're potentially missing out on lots of excellent candidates if they're insisting on people purely based on a passport or a first language. Although I am aware there's obviously contexts where, you know, that's also there's legal reasons why people from certain places can't be recruited. So move on to thinking about induction and onboarding, which is again, I think can solve a lot of problems before they start if you can get this bit right. So this involves creating materials for both students and staff who are joining your school. This is going to include things like a student induction pack. And here's a list of things you might include in that. Again, this content is going to vary according to how your school does things, but might include stuff like details of your EAL program is going to be important. Profiles of your staff in a sort of student-friendly way with photos and, you know, so they information about them and their hobbies and interests. I think can make it a lot less intimidating for students coming into the department. If you're able to provide translations of key information, if you have students from particular language backgrounds who come to your school on a regular basis, and also things like expectations and what I mean by that is including information for expected school behavior, of course, but also things like routines. So what happens at the start of school, what happens at break time, what happens in meal times, because if a child has come from a different country and culture, then, you know, simple things like that may need explaining, and it can be a cause of quite a lot of anxiety if the student isn't familiar with them. So again, it will depend on the kind of students that are coming into your school, whether they're from other, you know, international contexts or whether they're from the local context, as to whether that's useful. And you want to include, I think, lots of visuals because that helps scaffold understanding. And things like photos of key locations in the school, of the building or the classroom that the students need to be for their EAL lessons, or photos of staff, as we've mentioned. But all these things are going to really help reduce that anxiety for new starters and just makes them feel a lot more comfortable, which is really important. Of course, we want to do a similar thing for new staff starting as well, especially if you've got a large or expanding team. And again, it might include things like organizational chart that shows the staffing structure and where the EAL team lies within that. Obviously, the structure of the program and how it works. Information on CPD and what's expected there. Things like observation procedures and useful links for key documentation and external resources as well, both to internal school systems, but also external resources as well. And lastly, a key aspect of onboarding for uh, multilingual children's often having some kind of buddy system. Um, Again, it can be quite formal with quite a systematic approach, um, such as schemes like the Young Interpreter Program that gets used here in the UK. That provides there's some materials that provide basic training to older students to support new arrivals, but it can also be done on a much more informal basis as well. Um, okay, so here we are as our doting parent feeding its chicks, and that illustrates our slide on parent information. So again, good quality information for parents, really important, and it solves a lot of problems before they become problems if you do it well. Again, I think a lot of the issues with parents come from misunderstandings around the EAL program and what it does and what it doesn't do. Um, Obviously, there's some crossover here with the onboarding information and also the assessment stuff we discussed as well. But I think here are the key aspects you want to make sure parents can understand or that will be useful in dealing with parents. So some form of welcome email template, which welcomes the student and the parent to the department. Information on different pathways, so how a learner's progressing through the program, and perhaps for secondary as well, what options are available to them in terms of exams, or especially English proficiency exams or home language qualifications, for example. You want to include information on the curriculum and exam system, again, particularly if you're used to getting students coming from other international contexts and other systems where those might be different. So just explaining what those exams are, especially all the horrible acronyms and abbreviations that we like to use. Information on testing and benchmarks, really important to have clarity about when those happen, what the grading system you use is, and what the benchmarks are for progression. And again, if you have people joining your school from other countries or cultures, then it's really important to have that information on the local context, things like, customs, but also useful of places and events and social groups. And, if there's a parent group or things like that available, it's a great way to signpost it in the EAL welcome pack. And the other thing is really important, I think, is to talk about guidance on home language development. So, your school may have a formal offer for these things, which is great. But if not, then it could simply be advice on the importance of fostering home language and reassuring parents that developing home language literacy has positive effects on English language acquisition. They don't just need to be using English at all times at home or anything like that, especially if they're not comfortable doing so. That home language development has huge benefits holistically for the student. Okay, and finally, the boring stuff. I mean, this is a very subjective perspective. I appreciate, but yeah, we all need to create administrative systems and documents if we're going to set up a functioning department. So there's a list here of things that you can include, and this list was mainly gleaned from Peter Clements's blog on setting up an ELT department at eltplanning.com. So I highly recommend you go over there and have a look. He's got a wonderful blog. He's got a wonderful blog, and he talks about this stuff. Okay. Sorry, I'm just looking at some of the questions that have popped up in the chat since I was talking. But yeah, again, I'm not going to talk through any of this stuff in depth, but these are the types of things that you might want to think about. But obviously, it will also be school specific to some extent in terms of what you're required to do. All right, so that was a sort of very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the policies and procedures that I think if you get in place, you're going to be setting yourself up for success. So for the last section, we're just going to look ahead how you might sort of maintain and grow what you've established, because obviously this is also important. We want to keep improving what we're doing. So you'll notice our pots of compost from the previous slides have magically developed into thriving tomato plants. So, representing the fact that once we've got everything up and running, how do we ensure that we maintain and develop what we're doing? So I think the key term I would say here is accountability. So you want to make sure there's clarity around who is responsible for what. Um, Now, ideally, there should be obvious accountability for EAL and multilingualism running all the way up the school from EAL coordinator all the way up to school ownership. Um, but so it can be useful to map this out or ask for this to be mapped out for you. But I appreciate that that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, as the EAL coordinator, you're the only person accountable, right? Nobody else wants to know. And perhaps you don't have the decision-making powers needed to make all the changes you want, and that's also a situation some people find themselves in. So, some questions you might want to ask then, if you're in that position, are as follows. So yeah, it's really finding out these things. And if there aren't any clear answers to these questions, at least it might help people think about, oh, yeah, maybe there does need to be some accountability here, and perhaps it might nudge people or nudge school leadership towards making sure there is some accountability. The second thing that's going to be really important is having some kind of quality assurance to make sure that you are understanding what is happening and enabling you to make good decisions about things that you do. And I think the more systematic and embedded that process is, and the more triangulated it is, the more different sources of evidence you get, then the more beneficial it's going to be. So this would include, all the things you might typically think of, like observations and um, curriculum evaluation. There also is often an element of data analysis. Once you start collecting that data, are you making sure you're using that wisely and looking at trends? Perhaps you want to look at things like learners from a particular language background, or track learners who've had a particular amount of time in the EAL program to sort of be able to understand what impact your provision is having. This also includes things like getting feedback on CPD and understanding impact for CPD as well, and student voice. And again, most schools will have some form of student questionnaire. You may need to create your own specifically for EAL if you want to, but there may be something that already exists. And lastly, continual professional development is really important, specifically for EAL within your school, both within the EAL team, but also the whole school staff more widely as well. So things you might want to think about here are, identifying who are your EAL champions. Okay, who are the people who are doing excellent examples of good practice that you can share with others. Encouraging things like peer observations can be really helpful. Peer observations also, if you can do peer planning, actually, that's the thing that I've seen have the most positive impact in a lot of schools. Which is just, if you can, finding a way for an EAL specialist and a subject specialist to sit there together and plan a lesson or scheme of work together. And then, the amount of learning that sort of goes both ways in that kind of process, if you can give it space, is really, can be really powerful. And sets and training, of course. Things like portfolios, recording, CPD, and also having a measure of impact, or trying to measure CPD impact. Notoriously difficult, but we need to try, and getting feedback and trying to track impact is important. And again, as with quality assurance as well, having the student voice is important too, to understand what the changes in the classroom, what effects they're having on the students. Okay. I noticed somebody just mentioning an EAL curriculum which aligns with mainstream and how you would go about doing this. That is a good question, and again, there isn't. I wish there was a simple answer, but because there aren't. It's not, as far as I'm aware, there isn't anything that's sort of pre-existing that's out there that's an amazing that matches language skills with subject skills across a curriculum. And that's because obviously curriculums are different in every school. So it's quite a tricky thing to do. But a starting point would be to look at having some kind of planning process where you can identify language needs in different subject areas and try and sort of match them with particular topics. Pauline Gibbons is a useful person to read about this. She has a framework for sort of, linguistically aware planning, essentially, where you, for each topic, you would also have, let's say, a list of vocabulary that's related to that topic or a list of structures. It's not something that can happen necessarily very quickly, but that's what one thing that I've seen schools do. Okay, just finally to summarize then, I'm not going to pretend that any of this is easy. Okay, I'm just talking through it like, yeah, it's the easiest thing in the world. But I think setting up an EAL department from scratch, we have to recognize is it's a bit like swimming up a waterfall, right? It's a lot of obstacles and challenges. And I think we can summarize what we've talked about here, which is creating an action plan, choosing an assessment framework, setting up those processes, and then having systems to monitor and refine and revise what we're doing. Yeah, the author name Sobia is Pauline Gibbons. I'll just type that in the chat. Okay. So I hope that some of the ideas here have given you some confidence and a greater sense of purpose. And I'll bring back Clueless Kevin. And through following, some of these ideas and guidances, he has now become King Kevin, the EAL king for his school. Master of all he surveys. So I hope that embedding some of these ideas and processes can lead to success, and in particular for the multilingual children in our schools to get the support that they deserve. So thank you very much. I just want to draw your attention before we say goodbye to our upcoming courses for the next sort of 12 months or so. Especially we've got a couple of courses for EAL coordinators. So if that's your role or related to what you do, those courses go into a lot more detail about how to think about organizing EAL provision more effectively. And we also have a brand new course as well for school leaders, specifically on how to lead for multilingualism effectively. So, as I said, I don't know there's much time for any more questions, and I don't know that there are any other questions. I'm just having a scroll through. Someone's asking for initial assessments, and yeah, that's a tricky one again. I've never seen anyone with a single answer for that question in terms of initial assessments. Most schools will end up using a combination of different things, and I think that's the key answer there, is to make sure you're not just relying on one thing, but when you're doing initial assessments, use a few different methods and tools and work out what works for you in your context. All right, everyone. Thank you for attending today, and yeah, we'll hopefully we will be sending you an email with all the links and the resources that I've talked about in this webinar, and hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar. So bye bye everyone, and thank you.